Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. We're now just short of 2 years from the start of the Ombudsman's jurisdiction in the municipal sector. I'm going to talk very briefly, sort of highlights of our jurisdiction. Hopefully a lot of you will have attended other presentations and know a little bit about our role and function. For those who haven't, we've got a lot of really good materials on our website about that. Since 2016, there have been quite a few changes. One is we now have an ombudsman, Paul Dubé, who started April 1st, 2016. And I think if you've heard him speak, and he's gone out to a lot of municipal events, you'll know that he puts a real emphasis on collaboration, on building relationships. And he's really set a tone for our office, emphasizing that. In a nutshell, what we do is we're an independent and impartial legislative officer, and we resolve complaints brought to us by all sorts of folks about the administrative conduct of public sector bodies. As a result of Bill 8 and the expansion of our authority, that includes municipal bodies, including councils and committees, local boards, and municipally controlled corporations. Our mandate is to look at administrative conduct. We're not there to look at the political decisions, for instance, that are generated by a municipal council. We're looking at the administration of those decisions. Now, we may have issues with the implementation and with the decision that's being implemented, and the Ombudsman can make recommendations to suggestions for change if he has concerns. But we're not a court. We can't issue orders. We can't compel anybody to take a particular course of action. The Ombudsman's authority is in issuing reports and recommendations. And some of the key things about our office, we're independent, we're impartial, we don't advocate for any particular side, and we can really serve as a useful validating process for a lot of organizations we have oversight for. People come to us as a neutral third party, and in a lot of cases what we find is what they're complaining about, there is no basis. So we can provide that validation for the organizations under our authority, and we can also provide constructive feedback where we find that there are issues so that they can get to the root of the problems illustrated by complaints and try to prevent their recurrence. We're also last resort. That's really important to remember in terms of complaint resolution. We don't want to get involved if an individual hasn't gone to the body first in attempted resolution. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today, going to talk about complaint processes. We have discretion too. We do not have to investigate. There are many cases that we can decline to investigate for various reasons, including if we find that a complaint is frivolous or vexatious. We have fairly formal investigative powers. If we're doing a formal investigation and we have to give formal notice, say, to the municipality, and we can summons witnesses and we can inspect premises, but we like to, wherever possible, reserve that for very rare cases. We like to resolve things informally with the cooperation of the body whenever we can, and the vast majority of our cases are dealt with informally. We have several teams that deal with complaint resolution. The early resolutions team, they use alternate dispute resolution techniques to try to get things done as soon as possible, to resolve things. And when we say resolution, it's resolution to our satisfaction. Complainants may not be fully happy with what we have done, but we have to satisfy ourselves that there's no issue. And they deal with the bulk of cases. They resolve many within a number of weeks and even days. A lot of the issues are communication, and they try to get people connected with the right people at the municipality. Our investigations team deals with the more complex cases that might require a little bit more research. They will escalate issues up the bureaucracy to make sure they're talking to the right people that can affect a resolution. But even though it's called an investigations team, most of the cases they deal with are also resolved informally. Our special ombudsman response team is the team that you tend to hear about in the news. For instance, recently they had done a systemic investigation into bus delays in the city of Toronto, and the ombudsman issued a report in August called The Root of the Problem about his concerns there and recommendations for change. And our legal team also gets involved with investigations if they're complex, if there are legal issues, and some of you may know us for the open meetings complaints investigation. We've had jurisdiction since 2008 as a default investigator of complaints about closed meetings held allegedly improperly by municipal councils, local boards, and their committees. And they do the work there because it's rather technical. They have to figure out if the legislation is being complied with and if procedure bylaws locally have been complied with. And they're a little bit more formal. When I talk about we try to promote informal resolutions, open meetings in most cases tend to involve a formal investigation report of some kind, although you will see more frequently that we're closing things off using letters. So where are we? Up to September 11th, we had 5,119 complaints about municipalities, and we have closed the majority of those informally. We get complaints about anything you're going to get complaints about, we'll get complaints about at the municipal level. We issued our latest annual report for 2016-2017 fiscal year, and the top 5 complaints were first about councils and committees. About 509 complaints about councils and committees. Sometimes those are from the public, sometimes they're from council and committee members. Bylaw enforcement ranks second with 251, and that includes people concerned because the municipality isn't rigorously enforcing their bylaws, and those people that are concerned because the municipality is rigorously enforcing their bylaws against them. Ontario Works also ranks up there at 248, and that's understandable. Any income programs in the provincial sphere as well generate a lot of complaints. Housing, 220, and hydroelectricity, 194. We do not have jurisdiction over Hydro One anymore, but we do have jurisdiction over many municipal hydroelectric facilities. And while most complaints are resolved informally, we have, since 2016, launched 4 formal investigations. We've completed 3. Some of you may be familiar, we did one in Brampton, and it was a little unusual. This was a systemic investigation. It was carried out by our Special Ombudsman Response Team at the invitation of the City of Brampton. They were concerned about various administrative issues. We chose non-competitive procurement as the issue that we wanted to go in and look at. As a result of our investigation, we didn't find any issues that rose to the level that would warrant a formal report and recommendations under our Act. We did report back to the municipality. We made some suggestions, including because there were so many issues around financial accountability, they might want to consider appointing an Auditor General. We had a case with Elliott Lake Residential Development Commission, which was a little bit different because it had to do with whether or not they were complying with open meeting requirements, not in the Municipal Act, but in their own constituting legislation. And then we had a case called Red Rock, and I'll just spend a little bit of time on that because I think when people saw that, some of them questioned, we talk about informal resolution, why did you go into Red Rock? It's a small community, I think under 900 population in northern Ontario. However, we tried. We made several attempts to resolve this with talking to the Chief Administrative Officer, talking to the Mayor. We shared information that we had about court cases that were relevant to the situation and policies that reflected best practices in other communities. But they weren't interested in resolving it at that stage. And it had to do with trespass notices. And we find in municipalities and in school boards, this is an issue that generates a fair number of complaints. The individual who complained was issued a trespass notice prior to becoming a member of council. It had to do with when he went in to file his papers with respect to the fall 2014 election. There was a little exchange that happened at the counter at the municipality, and one of the municipal officials filed a complaint under their anti-harassment policy. And it was investigated by the Chief Administrative Officer, who was also a witness to the event. It was investigated very summarily, and a trespass notice was issued in 2014 and was continually renewed. And the individual who is now a council member, he was successful in council, contacted us in 2016 and said, listen, I am banned from going into the municipal offices during working hours, business hours. Now, he could still attend meetings because they happened after hours in that particular township, but he couldn't access the library, couldn't use the computer there, couldn't use the internet there, and he said it, affected him. And it was really one of those very contentious situations. The difficulty is when we looked at it, in terms of the anti-harassment policy, it wasn't actually followed to the letter. There were a lot of problems with the clarity of it. It was applied against a citizen, but it wasn't clear on the face of it whether it should be applied to a citizen. It wasn't referenced in the policy. And it was really it was a template that the municipality had used, because you have to have a policy of this nature under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but it hadn't actually been tailored to the municipality. It even included reference to, you put complaints to the president of the company, right? And so there were some issues with that. The individual who did the investigation wasn't trained, had never done that kind of investigation before. There really wasn't any proper record keeping, and it wasn't consistent with the law about issuing trespass notices. So we went in, we did an investigation, we set all of that out. And, there are cases, of course, where you can issue trespass notices, but one of the things the courts will look at is, was it a violent act? How threatening was it? And there was no evidence to suggest that this was the case. The individual asked a lot of questions, obviously caused some concern, but it just didn't rise to that level. The Ombudsman made 11 recommendations, including that the trespass notice be revoked, but also that the municipality put in place a number of policies, including a code of conduct, as well as some kind of policy to deal with the kind of behavior they were concerned about, sort of unreasonable conduct on the part of a member of the public coming in. How do you deal with that? And we gave them some suggestions. Now, the municipality, we can only make recommendations. We can't force anybody to adopt them. They weren't particularly keen on our recommendations in terms of responding to our report. However, I have noted publicly their minutes do indicate they are adopting a code of conduct, so something is shifting there. But I think one of the important things about that particular report is it does provide some guidance to municipalities who are struggling with these issues. I've got to say, one of the top issues people talk about when we're talking about complaint resolution are frivolous and vexatious complaints and unreasonable people, and what do you do? Now, that was one of the formal complaints that we investigated. This is more typical. This was a case where somebody had a bone to pick with the chief building official in the municipality, and the municipality was addressing the concerns. However, the Building Code Act actually requires that a code of conduct be developed to deal with the chief building official, and they didn't have one. So we dealt with the municipality. We suggested, they may want to have a view to that, to creating that code of conduct to come in compliance with the requirements. And since that time, they have published such a code. So the reason I'm here today, the main focus, is on what can you do to create a complaints process that reflects best practices. We are really keen on seeing every municipality have their own locally developed complaints process. You know what works for you. There isn't one size fits all. We want to be last resort. We think that complaints should be resolved at the lowest possible level. So we want you to have accessible, strong complaints process. If you can, consider local accountability officers. Some municipalities have appointed municipal ombudsman, integrity commissioners to help with those things. We've seen an uptick in municipalities actually appointing municipal ombudsman. Prior to Bill 8, I think there was one mandatory municipal ombudsman in Toronto, and now there are quite a few municipalities who use the services of an ombudsman. So we don't want to get involved until individuals have gone to the local complaints process and finished that and remain dissatisfied. If you have a local ombudsman, our statute says we cannot get involved unless they finish their work, or they've refused to investigate, or if there's a time limit for bringing a complaint forward, that has expired. And it's a really good thing. It's really positive. I can't underestimate how important it is. Having an objective well-explained review can encourage acceptance of your decisions, your actions. If you don't engage in that sort of first level of complaint resolution, people tend to not comply. They lose interest. It can result in people actually lost revenue in some circumstances for the municipality. But if you have one, if you have a strong and credible complaints process, people sort of, even if they don't accept the result, if you have a process that's out there, it's public, people know what to expect, they're more likely to accept it. Even acceptance, since they're not going to go further, they may not like it. We have, I don't know, how many out there have complaints policies at their municipalities? Okay, a fair number, and that's good. One of the things that we have done, because people ask us for guidance, like you want some materials to help guide, well, what's a good complaints process? We've had these little tip cards. We had them at our booth today. And I'm going to go through some of the things that we suggest that people do in developing a complaints process. One is everyone should have it. And the direction should come from the top. I mean, staff can develop the process and bring it forward to council, but this should be something that's approved by council. It should have that stamp of approval. It should be publicly posted. Don't hide it. It's not very helpful for anybody if it's not available. And train your staff on it. They have to know what they're applying. And some of the things we suggest, you get inundated with service requests. Those aren't necessarily complaints that we're talking about. You should deal with them, and people should know how to deal with them. But distinguish, someone needs to pick up my garbage from they continually pick up my garbage late and they're rude to me. That is the kind of complaint we're talking about. Also, complaints and inquiries. Some people make inquiries. If they're not a complaint, you treat it different. If someone has a compliment or suggestion to make, maybe you have a different way of dealing with those. Now, some municipalities also have a separate process for dealing with monetary claims. If you have potholes and negligence claims against the municipality, it's a little bit different than what we're generally talking about. If you have an insurer that deals with that, you make sure there's a separate process and people know how to access that for those kinds of complaints. You should also distinguish if you have a code of conduct, and everybody will have to have a code of conduct in accordance with Bill 68 once it comes fully into effect. You should distinguish that and tell people where to go if what they're really concerned about is a code of conduct complaint. And provide any service referral information, contact numbers for staff so people know where to go. Are you going to accept anonymous complaints? It's up to you. If you do, make it clear you do. If you don't, make it clear you don't. And we also suggest that resolution of complaints be addressed at the lowest possible level. So, first deal with the department. Then there should be a clear complaint path that people can follow as they go up the system. If they're not satisfied with what the department head has to say, then where do they go next? Quite often the ultimate complaint reviewer is a clerk or city manager or CAO. And then once that's completed, that process, you can tell people to complain to our office. We typically, if we're making inquiries and people are complaining about what the municipality has done in response to their complaint, we'll go to the last level that reviewed it. And you should have clear timelines. People should know what to expect. When should they hear back that acknowledged that their complaint has been received, and some indication of what they can expect in terms of timelines for actually reviewing the complaint. Something that we see quite commonly as an issue when people complain to us about the municipality's response to a complaint is lack of records. So it's really, really important to keep records of the interaction that the person complaining has had with the municipality. So you make it clear what you have done, and when we come in, say, in response to a complaint, we can confirm what you have done. The staff should also know what the scope of their authority is, so clear delegation as to what they can and cannot resolve. Who's going to be able to say, okay, we're going to issue a formal written apology, set it out. And it has to make sense for your municipality. As I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all model. If you do get a complaint about a staff member's competence, and it happens in our case as well, make sure the person actually reviewing that complaint isn't involved in the initial response to the complaint that the person is concerned about. You want to have independence. That was one of the concerns that we had in the Township of Red Rock case, is because when the chief administrative officer was a witness, when they were directly involved in the incident, it really taints the process. So you want to make sure that, to the extent you can, somebody is not involved who's doing the review and responding to the individual. And the review should be thorough. You should be training your staff that they should be looking at all the relevant information, the relevant documents. You should make it clear to staff that they have to cooperate. So if somebody is charged with responding to a complaint, your staff have to know that they have to cooperate with that individual and share information. And there is a concept in law called administrative fairness, and the idea is that you should be able to respond to any information adverse to your interests if it has the chance to negatively affect you. So if you've got information that you're going to be relying on to deny a complaint, you might want to just contact the individual first. This is what we do in our office, and say, listen, this is where we think we're going with it. This is the information we have. Is there anything else you have to say about it? And you can put that right into the process that you have for dealing with complaints. Ideally, in most complaints, you should have some kind of written explanation concerning a decision that's been made in response to a complaint, and you should tell people where they can go next. Another good thing to think about for your complaint policy is to have a note. Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt, but you said tell them where to go next. You kind of left that wide open.
Well, you can go. Yeah.
That's why we're sniffing.
Yeah, yeah. And if it's up your, if you haven't finished your complaint process locally, then it's the next level. If you've done everything you can, it's us. It's us. And it's okay. As I said in the beginning, complaints get a really negative, people are really negative reaction to complaints. I know when we issued our annual report, we had a number of municipalities calling us and saying, we have all these complaints, and some reporters are interested in these complaint statistics. And we said, you know what, complaints shouldn't be viewed so negatively. One, a lot of the complaints that we get, you're not even going to know about because there's really nothing to them. And we're starting to refer to more as cases. Someone comes forward and says, I don't know what they've done. And we say, okay, well, have you gone there? No. Well, go back. There's a process. Go back through it. And that's it. That's all it is. And, there are ways that you can use to gauge what's happening in your communities, to address issues that have been percolating. They really should be much more positive. But, yeah, send them to us. It's particularly good with those frequent flyers, vexatious individuals that you really have difficulty dealing with. Maybe it's not such a bad idea that you can say, well, you know what? We've dealt with you. We've gone through our process. Now you can go off to the Ombudsman. And they become our problem. We have to address their issues. And, sometimes people who are very, very difficult to deal with actually have valid issues. And sometimes we respond to the behavior. But in a lot of cases, if they come forward and they're truly, there isn't any merit to it, we can see through that. And we're a neutral party saying, you know what? The municipality hasn't done anything wrong. Now, they may continue to complain to us, and we address that through our own process. To the extent possible, there should be some confidentiality. In reality, most cases you're going to have to know who complained, and you're going to have to disclose enough information that you can effectively resolve it internally. And to deal with those frivolous and vexatious folks, the real ones that tie up your time, and you spend so much in the way of resources trying to address their issues, it's not a bad idea to have a policy about what you're going to do with those individuals. There have been a few municipalities that have taken that approach. There's for instance, Wasaga Beach has a handling unreasonable customer behavior policy. Have a look at that. There's the program, respect program that Town of Oakville and some of the other municipalities have, which really sets out how we're going to respond when you inundate us with emails every day with the big raised caps and start leaving nasty messages for our staff and emails. And so it gives you a structure. It sets out the expectations for the public on how you're going to deal with them. And it gives your staff some tools to address them. Because not having a complaint policy is not going to stop people from complaining. It's just going to hinder your ability to effectively respond to those complaints. Another thing I think is useful for complaint policies is to sort of set out what kind of general remedies that you might, that they might expect as a result of complaining. Even things like apologies. Apologies aren't a bad thing. That we have something in Ontario called the Apology Act, so you're not liable if you go out and apologize for something. Have a look at that, and sometimes it can be really effective. Sometimes there may be changes in policies and practices that result from a complaint. So there are various things that you might want to generally sort of set out examples, not necessarily limited, but some suggestions of the kinds of things that people can achieve through a complaints policy. If you've got other relevant policies, it's also useful to reference them in some way. Accessibility policy. You have an accessibility policy at your municipality. What if people have difficulty accessing your policy, accessing your complaint policy? Well, you can refer them to that and accommodations under the Ontario Human Rights Code. You might have a general service policy that applies, and you want to reference that. It's also helpful, too, if you have some kind of feedback mechanism, whether if you have a website, you can have a feedback button so people can tell you how they felt about going through your complaint policy. Gives you some idea how effective it is and things you might want to tweak a bit. Ideally, it's good to keep statistics. How many complaints have you got? What were the resolutions? What were people complaining about? It helps you internally planning. Where should you focus your energy? Is there a legitimate concern there? Is it a systemic concern? Is there something we should be applying ourselves to remediate? And one of the things about complaint policies is I've been talking about complaint policies for a number of years at various events. And one of the things I said, in many cases, people already are responding to complaints in a certain way. It's just not written down. So it's a useful exercise to go through to sort of, what are we doing now? Okay, let's write that down. We can tweak it a bit. It doesn't necessarily have to be an elaborate process. It will probably depend on the nature of the municipality. It's helpful too for us when our office calls. It's really really good to be able to have a municipality say, okay, we did this. Here's our policy. Here's our procedure. And here's the file with all the information that shows the contacts we've had and ultimately what we decided. There's some great resources out there. I often recommend the AMCTO website. They have a really good municipal Google search, so you can search all sorts of policies that are used at municipalities of varying depths, and it's really a great resource. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit, because I think this is probably timely and on people's minds because of the Bill 68 and the pending amendments, codes of conduct. Not necessarily content for codes of conduct. I know the ministry, there's some indication in the regulations the ministry may be making some regulations to talk about the content of codes of conduct. How many people have codes of conduct in their municipalities? A fair number. For council? Yeah. Because when we first got into this business of looking, we do municipal surveys. Some of you may be familiar with this, and we ask about your complaint mechanisms and whether you have accountability officers and whether you have codes of conduct, and we didn't distinguish them. And then we realized it makes a difference whether it's a code of conduct for staff and a code of conduct for council. So soon they're going to be mandatory. and you're going to have to use the services of an integrity commissioner. So we've given some thought. We have had some complaints about integrity commissioners. We have looked into some best practices across jurisdictions. And similar to developing your general complaints process, we've come up with some suggestions about the procedure for code of conduct. This isn't your code of conduct. This is how you're going to implement it. And it's really useful to think about that, because integrity commissioners have a fair amount of discretion, but municipalities may want to really think about what the process should look like, reflecting their unique context. But one of the things you should, again, you've got council approving it, and it should be publicized. And it helps everybody. It helps integrity commissioners because they know what the rules are. It helps those that are subject to the code of conduct when a complaint comes in. It helps the public when they want to make a complaint to understand what they can expect. One of the things that we strongly promote is that there shouldn't be any gates in terms of fees for complaints to integrity commissioners. It's a real barrier. And in the past, when I've talked to people about this, quite often the response I get from municipalities is, well, if we don't have a fee, we're going to get all those vexatious complainants coming in, right? And they're going to tie up all our resources. And integrity commissioners cost money, and we can't necessarily budget in advance because we don't know how much they're going to be utilized or how much investigating they're going to do. And what I say to that is, okay, then have a discretion that the integrity commissioner has to summarily dispose of those cases without engaging in an investigation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. If you're going to have a written complaints process, and quite frankly a lot of municipalities do, think about barriers to access. So we had got a complaint at one point because complaints had to come in through with an affidavit, and people had to pay to get it commissioned, and it was costing people money to do that. So you might want to think of other ways around that so people aren't paying out money to have to do an affidavit. Discretion to decline to investigate is really important. In our office, we would just be inundated with work and unable to, I think, to effectively manage our cases if we didn't have that discretion. And you can consider giving your integrity commissioner discretion not to proceed, for instance, if the complaint is frivolous, vexatious, or not made in good faith. If it's being addressed by some other mechanism, in some municipalities you'll see you've got a code of conduct complaint and you've got a complaint of harassment under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Should they concurrently be going on? Does one really occupy the field? Think about that. What do you want to do in those cases? If it's clearly a criminal matter, in essence that the person is bringing forward, well, maybe you want to say, in those cases, it should be referred to the police. And what if on the face of it, it just isn't a code of conduct offense? They've made all sorts of allegations, but it doesn't engage your code of conduct. You should give the integrity commissioner the discretion to be able to address those effectively. It will save everybody a lot of time, money in the end. We recommend that integrity commissioners be required to confirm any decision they make not to investigate in writing and to provide some reasons. And that's because we've had some cases where that wasn't done, and at least the complainant, they come to us and they want some clarity. They want some reasons to support why the complaint hasn't gone forward, and I don't think that's too much to ask. If you're going to set time limits for people to bring complaints under a code of conduct to an integrity commissioner, you might want to consider allowing the integrity commissioner some scope to waive that in compelling cases. There are confidentiality requirements that apply to integrity commissioner investigations. You might want to set that out. And also the limits to confidentiality. Some code of conduct procedures or protocols will say, as between the parties, there isn't confidentiality. You're going to disclose who's complaining and the nature of the complaint and the respondent. But with respect to witnesses, sometimes it's useful to clearly state that the integrity commissioner can consider whether or not to disclose witness names. There may be circumstances where it could have a real chilling effect, particularly if you may have staff who are worried about retaliation. You want to make sure that the integrity commissioner is required to acknowledge complaints in some way. And if someone's filed a complaint and it's being dismissed as frivolous and vexatious, you might want to provide that the respondent should still know what's happened, that a complaint has been received, what the nature of it is, and what the disposition was. And if the complaint is proceeding, you want to make sure that the respondent has notice of the allegations in a timely way. One thing you also might want to consider is allowing for mediation and formal resolution. There are a lot of cases where, if you only give the Integrity Commissioner the option of dismissing it under that discretion or launching a formal investigation, you're going to get a formal investigation. But there may be circumstances, and I know a lot of Integrity Commissioners do this anyway, where they will make an effort to mediate complaints, and it can be very, very effective, and it's also saves everyone a lot of time and money. So you might want to think of formalizing something like that. And if there is going to be an investigation or inquiry, because integrity commissioners have authority under Section 34 of the Public Inquiries Act to have hearings, you might want to refer to that. There's been recent case law. There was a case, some of you may be familiar, DiBiase and Vaughan. Anybody familiar with that case? It was a significant integrity commissioner case. One of the things I found very useful and instructive was the court paid a lot of attention to the complaint protocol. Councillor DiBiase made a lot of complaints that the investigation was not fair. It was procedurally unfair. However, one of the things the court could do is said, well, it was consistent with the published complaint protocol. You knew what to expect. This is what happened. You had an opportunity to respond. That's it. So it is really something really important to consider once we move forward. If you don't have a code of conduct as you're developing it, and even if you do, if you don't have a complaint protocol, to consider adopting one. This is just in terms, if you're going to talk about having formal investigations carried out by the Integrity Commissioner, you might want to address some of these things. What happens with notice, explaining the access to information. Integrity Commissioners under the legislation have a lot of access to municipal information. You want to make sure your staff understands that they keep records. One of the things they might consider is providing for some sort of preliminary reporting process where they provide a summary of their findings and get a response first from the respondents. If there's going to be a formal hearing, what's it going to look like? One of the things that we see in terms of the complaints coming in about integrity commissioners to our office relates to how they report out when they've looked into something. And we sort of come up with some best practices, and we think it would be worthwhile for complaint procedures to reflect them. So your expectation should be that your integrity commissioner is going to address all the issues that are brought forward by a complainant, because if not, in some way, because if not, they're just going to come back and be complaining to the municipality, that they follow the investigative procedure, that they refer to key evidence and submissions of the parties, and as well as specific codes of conduct provisions. You know, we've seen some where it's so general, you really don't know what the finding is based on. It's just like the code of conduct. Well, what provision of the code of conduct? What aspect of the code of conduct? And also, you'd like to see evidence that's been relied on to reach the conclusions. Why have you reached the conclusion that the member has contravened the code of conduct? If an integrity commissioner is assessing credibility, you want to see a little bit of reasoning why, an explanation. It's not enough these days to say, well, based on their demeanor, you know, I thought they were credible, or, you know, I just prefer this person as evidence to somebody else. There should be some kind of rationale, and why specific recommendations have been made by the integrity commissioner. And in terms of your process, you can do it. Some municipalities have a committee that first looks at the reports from the integrity commissioner. Some will go to full council. You got to figure out how you want to do it. In terms of sanctions, it's useful for people to understand what really is at stake. Under the Municipal Act, you can get reprimands, you can get suspension up to 90 days of a member's salary. But also there can be some ancillary kinds of things like apologies, and we might not want this member to sit on these committees, and other remedial measures you might want to flag. Who does what? This is an issue that some integrity commissioners have the authority to actually make the decision as to the recommendation. What we would say is a best practice is the integrity commissioner recommends to council. It's council's decision whether or not to adopt that particular recommendation. We also think that integrity commissioners should be asked to report annually, generally on what's been happening, the complaint trends, what they've supported, what they haven't supported generally, and what they're seeing. It helps inform you. It helps you also in terms of budgeting for the future. And there's going to be even more stuff going on, and you're going to have to think about how you're going to deal with that. If you're going to have a separate process for dealing with Municipal Conflict of Interest Act cases, because now your integrity commissioner is also going to have a mandate with respect to dealing with those. So people can come to us, as I've mentioned, about integrity commissioners after they have done their job. We are not integrity commissioners. We don't go out and do code of conduct investigations. We feel that that's a responsibility at the local level that should be done. When we do get a complaint about an integrity commissioner, we look at things like, well, did they act in accordance with the legislation or the complaint procedure? Did they consider all the issues? Did they follow a fair practice? Did they look at all the relevant information? And did they provide sufficient reasons to support their decisions? Some of the ones we had people complaining. There was one case where the integrity commissioner had looked at the complaint and said, you know what, you're really complaining about political conduct? This is politics. This isn't code of conduct. And we looked at it and said, yeah, you're right, that's what it is. It wasn't a detailed decision, but it was obvious on the face that it was sufficient given the context. And this case is important because it really addresses procedure. We got, very early on in our mandate, we got contacted by a person who was a member of a local board. And there had been a code of conduct complaint against this individual, and she didn't even know that the code of conduct applied in the particular case. And the municipality hadn't had a lot of experience with this, and she understood that there would be a closed meeting to consider the integrity commissioner's report. And if you know anything about the legislation, that's not what happens. It's something that is public. It's made available to the public. And she was caught by surprise because she ended up going to a meeting and had an opportunity, which is something that should be built in, to respond to the integrity commissioner's report, but did so publicly, and it was unexpected. So we talked to the municipality, and they revised their complaint procedure so it's clear what happens. So everybody's on the same page as to what happens when you have an integrity commissioner investigation. And they also trained their local board members so they understood the implications of having a code of conduct. We've also made a number of best practices suggestions to individuals about particular integrity commissioner complaints. We've had 53 complaints about commissioners since January 2016, and quite often we'll say, listen, you didn't say what you relied on in reaching, what evidence you looked at in reaching this decision. The person saying, you didn't look at X, Y, Z. They say, oh, I looked at those. Well, could you just tell them that? And if you'd done that in advance, then it would have resolved things. So I'm going to leave, if anybody has any questions, some time for questions, if you have about complaints processes or even our office in general.